Hello, this is Philip at thebest3d.com, and I had a question the other day from somebody who wanted to see how to create brushes that are not painting something, but rather just blurring it. And I'm not talking about smearing. We do have some predefined brushes under the Effects tab here for smearing. And those are great, but that's not what that person was looking for. Rather just blurring it under the brush, so without displacing the pixels, making it nonetheless blurry. So I don't think we have a preset for that, but it's easy to create one, and I wanted to cover that in a tutorial. What you see here is, of course, the media browser, browse media option, which has also a large collection of predefined brushes. And you'll see a effects tab here, which has some of these smearing and totally oils. In fact, let's pin this down here so we have the ability to get back to that fairly easily and constantly. So you see one brush here that I called just blur it. When I'm painting over it, as I'm painting, nothing shows, but when I let go, it has blurred it there. So this is sort of the effect we're looking for, and you could use that to blur the identity of somebody's face on a picture, or a license plate on a car, or whatever it is, if you want or maybe even just to show something as being out of focus because it's at a different distance from what the focal point of the camera was supposed to represent, right? Something far away or something too close in a macro photo. So lots of different uses for that, and I wanted to show you some of the tricks you can use to make such a brush. I start typically with something like a smear brush like this, or a smear 100. That's the one I used in this case. And actually I started with an image that has a great number of very crisp lines. And so let's start from scratch and see how to actually make even just that image in the first place. So what I'll do is I'll erase the background. Something like, let's go to black. So I'll switch to two colors here and erase. Or you could right click and say erase to black. No matter what your primary and secondary colors are, left button, right button colors. Primary and secondary colors could be to anything, but you can still always also erase the current selection to white or to black. So let's go erase to black, and then set something like, let's go to filter, render, grid. All right, and so with the grid, you can start with a small grid with thin lines, set the thickness to low, and set the color to sort of a dark blue, right? That will, given that the eye is more sensitive to red, dark blue will appear a little bit farther away when compared to something that's intense red. So I'll use this for the dark parts that are at a distance, and okay that. And then I'll use the same filter again to render another grid. And the nice thing about this is that it doesn't erase to black, it just draws the grid on top. So you can actually draw another grid at a different size, different thickness too, right? And make it look like it's closer by virtue of having a different spacing, and on top of that also different appearance, brightness. Right? That's the key thing there. You might even have applied a little bit of a blur on those lines far away. Let's do that just to get the idea. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and you can, actually let's zoom in so we can really see this, but let's zoom in somewhere in the middle so we can do a side-by-side comparison. There you go. Let's go blur, Gaussian, enable the side-by-side, and start blurring one side. Not too much, just a little bit. There you go. And okay that. So now we have a slightly blurred set of lines at the distance, and we go to the filter again to render another set of lines. Grid, there it is. And so these are going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter, and they're also going to be fatter lines. Thickness is higher, and the grid distance, the spacing, the grid size is bigger too. And let's keep doing that. Let's add another level of slightly blurring it. Gaussian blur just a little bit. Same amount is good. Let's go do that. So we can see now, actually maybe that didn't apply it because we didn't change the values. So let's go blur again, Gaussian blur. Yeah, it doesn't do an initial application of it. So we can go and apply a little bit of blur to that. There you go. And then go back to filter, render the, the grade one more time, this time with even more spacing and even brighter. And let's start going into the reddish tint a little bit and make it even wider lines, something like this. Okay, that. And we'll do one more, and we'll keep this one crisp, and then we'll do one more and keep that one crisp as well. So it will be render the grade one more time, and this time will be totally red. I don't know, something like this here. Grid size, spacing, there you go. Let's find something that looks like it's just even more in front of the rest. There you go. So now we have, you know, a combination of lines, some of them already blurry in the background, some of them very crisp in the foreground. And let's go store this image. This is a precious development. Let's go store this image so we can easily go back or switch between this one that I did earlier and this one I just did now. And so what we want to do now is develop this brush that will do this thing here, just blur it, right? So we can just paint over it and blur parts of that, like along the line here. That brush can be used by other tools too. For instance, the linear tool here, to draw a line. Let me see if I can go here. Draw a line, let's say in a vertical direction. You see it's actually applying it along this path. Oh no, this one's actually doing a little bit of a smearing on top of it too. So it's not quite the same. So anyway, let's go and have a look at our initial image. There it is. And how to develop this brush that will do mostly, that's what we need to enable here. Yeah. We need to, we want to create this brush that will mostly blur and not really change the color's position or change the color, the pixels position or the pixels, like it won't appear to be smearing so much, but rather just blur. And so here's what we do. Let's start with a brush, such as one of those effects brushes, and take a smear 50 if you don't want it too big. Smear 100 will be a little bit wider, or a smear, a fairly narrow one. Let's do the smear 50. I haven't done this one yet. So smear 50 will of course smear it. That's not exactly what we're looking for. There's a couple of things we can change. In the brush settings, if we select the brushes here and click on settings, you'll see this brush settings panel. Let's make sure we pin this down so it doesn't go away. And we have the main tab in which we can add the bleed. That's a good start. The bleed will take some of the existing colors that the brush is painting over, especially when you start. Let's say if you start with red, it takes that red and bleeds it, especially if you go all the way to the maximum here. You'll see a little bit of that color being dragged in. Now, that's actually a replace mode, and the pixel replace mode by default, you can change that to be, actually no, I'm already on the smear mode since I selected that preset. So there's a smear, there's a paint smear, where there's a slightly different appearance, but still it's too much of that displacing of the pixels, right? We don't want that, no smearing in that sense. What we really should focus on is not so much the bleed, but rather a post effects. Let's go to the effects tab and enable it, and in there's really two things you want to do. For one is you want to reduce the amount of pigments. Normally you got 100% here, and the pigments are showing as is. So let's say, for instance, if we don't even do the smear, just the default mode, you're painting this thing, right? And normally you have the lifting, the pigment lifting at 0, so there is no lifting and smearing or blending of those. So what you see here is essentially a watercolor type or impasse. There's a couple of styles here. That's a watercolor, translucent watercolor, slightly different, but still the color of the brush is going to be quite visible there. And in order to prevent that, what you can simply do is reduce the pigment. If you increase it, you'll get more of it. and it might in fact take the color that you initially start on, like black or red or purple, pink or blue. So it drags that into the brush, it picks that. And if you don't want that, you say no pigments, please, all the way down to, well, not 0. The minimal here is 1. But now it's not doing any coloring anymore. If you have it anywhere in between, it's just very subtle. Right? You can see that it's still doing a little bit of coloring, but very subtle. And so what we'll do is just bring this to the minimum, but then we'll say, okay, no changing of color, but we still want to do something on those pixels as we paint over them. And what we want to do is lift them. We want to do pigment lifting. So when you do pigment lifting, let's do a little bit. After you let go, you'll see that it's blurred it, right? That's what the pigment lifting does, is it blends it back into sort of a scattered approach, scattered pattern. It blends it back, but not exactly at the same position, so it gives you that blurring effect. Now you don't want too much, or you want a little bit more, play with those a little bit to see if you want it just totally very strongly, or just a little bit, just a hint of it, of blurring. There, that's a nice one here. Let's go and finalize that. So what we'll do is we will essentially focus on having no pigments added, very little of that. And the edge level might make a little bit of a difference too, but it's subtle. That's for the concentration of the coloring on the edges. That actually does potentially have a nice little scattering or evening effect, so you might want to play with that as well. But the most important one really is the lifting. If you want just a little bit of blurring, bring this down to about 5 or 10, and you'll see some, so you can keep painting over it and keep blending it or blurring it, but it doesn't appear to be smearing it into a particular direction. So that's really what we were looking for. Well, it does a little bit, right? You can see that I've done this a few times, so there's now a little bit of a bend, a little bit of a curve to it, because it seems to be like following the direction in which you actually drag it or paint it. So what we'll do is essentially set it to something like that. Let's settle for about 20 here on this value. 21 edge level, probably something like that. And now we have a nice brush to blur with. So if I want to go here and blur this part, I just paint over it. And you have a couple of other values you could change. There is something here, the edge profile. I'm not quite sure what they represent, but or how much they look different in that appearance. You might want to experiment with that. Translucent watercolor, perhaps have less coloring effect. And then of course there's still also the mode. Instead of the default mode, you could say smear or paint smear. That also may have a slight impact. If you see still too much of that edge there, you might look at the edge, where is it? There is the value, this one here, edge level. Play with that a little bit to see if that allows you to find a better mode in which the edge is not distinct and visible so much anymore. But then the other things you might also want to do is actually change the softness of the image that is in the brush, right? So have it a bit more scattered or softer. You could do this with a custom brush, something like this, that you keep the bias down at 0, or anything like that, to make it very, very soft on the edges. Now you can tell, see here how we could still see the edge of the brush stroke. Here it's just not going to be seen anymore. So you have a brush image that is very subtle on the edges and only very gradually sends to the center. Whereas if you do something like a bias that goes this way and you have a very crisp edge, then you're going to see that transition from the image, where even when you paint over, see here this edge, you can tell there's a hint of a brush image that was there. You can see that right here, and where you blurred it on the inside, and this was the original image before. So if you set the bias to a very low value or negative value here, that will blur it to a very gradual progression, and you can just not tell where that brush stroke went. You can see where it's blurred, but you cannot see the edge of its effect. So that's about it. You have the brush image. You have the enabling the effects for no pigment, because if you do enable pigments, there will be some coloring. Although in this case it might be very little, the coloring might be, it's black, it's darkening it, but again, that's not good. We want to say, no, keep the colors as is, don't make it bright or color or white or black or something like that, but do work on the lifting, and that will give you a nice amount of blurring right there. So there's a number of parameters you can work with to create sort of a blurring effect. The step will get the blurring faster because the brush is applied more often on a short distance. If the mode has also a little bit of an effect, but of course with the pigment being at the minimal here, you don't really see the addition of the colors a whole lot. Let's see, there is the size. If it's a custom brush, you want to enable brush transform, and with that's over here, allow transforms. That will allow you to change the size, or you can do that here, and that will also allow the size to be following the tablet pressure. So that way you actually get control of how much blurring by how much how wide the blurring effect is by how much you press on the tablet. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, back to the settings. There was, as you saw here, the bleed factor, and that one too can have a nice subtle effect on how the colors are actually blended, bleed together with the background image. So you could put that one to the maximum and perhaps get a little bit more of an even effect there too. Anyway, so I think we have quite a good idea of how to set this up, and then of course the goal is to be able to use this brush again and again. And what I'd like to simply recommend at that point is to store it. Right, so go to the Browse Media option and save it rather. Put it right there. Select a category or create yourself a new category if you don't want to use the existing ones. You can do that right here. Create a folder that will create a category, or a named folder containing your own brushes, or you can add it to the effects or any of the others. And so the effects brush here, yeah, don't click that. That will allow you to change the name. You don't want to do that. Let's go select the effects brush, and now here I'm going to click here to save all the parameters and attributes of that current brush. Right, all this smearing action here, I want that to be saved in a new brush. So I'm going to go like this, click on that, and I'm going to give it a name. Just blur it already. Okay, and okay that. So now we have two blurry ones, one that's called Just Blur It. I can click that to blur. I can select this one, Just Blur It already, which does the same but with slightly different parameters. This one's actually a little bit stronger on the blur, but also darkening a little bit. I think I had a color that's black, but you can definitely tell it's a slightly different one. Let's go and compare them side by side. Click this to restore the image, and let's go Just Blur It. That's the original one. I'm just going to draw this line down, and then I'm going to do the same thing or similar with Just Blur It already, but on this one here. And you can see there's two different blurs here, but in either case it's blurred. One thing that I really like also is to actually use this brush now in other tools, right? So you can, the brush settings are what they are, and you can use now some other tools. Let's say the rectangle, not the rectangle fill, mind you. This one is the rectangle fill, currently with some paper texture in it, but the rectangle outline which will use the current brush. So as I'm brushing this rectangle outline, it's actually blurring it along the path, and so there's some funky stuff you can do with that too. Same with the oval. You can fill the oval if you pick the lower right half, diagonal lower right half of that icon, that makes it the fill. Whereas the outline, if you click the upper left, it's drawing that current brush, which does nothing but smearing. It's drawing that along the circle or the oval. There are a couple of others. There's this one here. Now this one seems to be resetting the effects tab. That's why it was still doing it was doing more than just blurring. It was also smearing it. So what we could do is, after we select this linear tool, we can make sure we re-enable this brush. Now we have just smearing it along that path. Looks like it's doing a little bit more than that. Let's go and try that one more time. No, that's good. Yeah. Wow, oh, it seems like it's actually doing the whole cover. That's an interesting one. Look at that. It's covering the entire area. Kind of a fan. Yeah, it's actually replaying that entire path, so it's smearing it along the entire path. Wow, that's another one I just discovered. Look at that. I thought I was a veteran and knew everything about Dogwaffle, and here we go. See something new again. So you can either draw along this line, or you can draw along this line and go down like that, and it's actually going to play that entire thing. Yeah. Beautiful. Let's see one more. That's the linear tool here. That was the linear tool. Now we do the curve tool. The curve tool is really fancy because you can put a couple of points here, and after 4 or more points it becomes a smooth curve. And then you could say, oh, let's go and render the current brush along that, right? And if you still have the brush effects enabled here, you can go and say paint the brush along that path, and there you go. Click it again and again, and well, that one's doing also quite a bit of displacement. And so anyway, so there's a number of ways. I really like the oval. That one I think is going to be my new favorite. To do all sorts of funky effects with that. Look at that. So take this and blur a little ring around it, and do another one like so, and then one more in the middle. And of course, sometimes you use that just as a starting point for, oh, I don't know, something like puppy ray tracing, elevation map. Let's do that final right here, or maybe take it into the 3D designer, which incidentally is also turning into a absolutely beautiful tool now with more new features. Check this out here on the more. Let's go here. You can enable the ray traced shadows, soft shadows. So we changed the light source orientation and the angles changing, and we have the elevation, and the shadows are rendered in real time on the GPU. Let's go with the zenith all the way out there and increase the brightness a little bit, increase the altitude. There you go. That's the reddish light. Let's give it even more reddish tint, maybe something like so. There you go. That's this light source. That's the one that casts the shadows. And then there is sort of a bluish light that we can also enable and give it a slightly different position. This one we might want to have a high altitude, low zenith, so it's kind of a light from above, kind of the skylight, and shines everywhere in about the same way. So it gives you a bit of an environment light or an ambient light effect. But let's focus on those other things here. We have some clouds now, some volumetric clouds, so particle based, that we can put here. Perhaps do a little bit faster preview and change the position or the appearance of these, and the elevation, and so we have some other elements you can add to that. The terrain also. Let me temporarily turn the clouds off here. Let's go add some terrain erosion. Oh, and then there's this new one, the sediments. So sediments are added too, and the erosion. Let's enable erosion and combine all that. Let's not pre-filter too much. Let's see a little bit more of the crisp details. Let's add some of this here. Let's add again, let's go back to the clouds here, The clouds will be lit by the light source, so you see some lighting effects that vary and change on that as well. Self-shadowing, more or less opaque, something like this. We could also change the background color, of course. So let's go do that here. Background color, something like a light blue. And then also make some fog here. Let's go do some fog levels. And that's a distant fog, right? So in the distance, it's disappearing and fading. But you can also add ground fog. And let's see that if I look at this part in the bottom here, enable the ground fog. That's over here, ground fog. Let's say nonlinear, and bring that up. So we have some dense fog on the ground as well. And so that's how this all works together now. You start painting, you then use that in ray tracing and create some other fancy effects, and hope you like that. Thanks for watching. This was really started as a way to create blurry brushes, and that's what we did. So here we go, take another look at blurring this thing, just painting over that. Hold on, let me go paint. Let's go something like this. Right, if you need to blur this. Now this one's a very strong blur, and you might want to just blur very lightly, so sometimes you just work with the opacity at that stage. Right, so you do a tiny little blur just like that. Alright, thanks for watching.